Olivia stood at the far end of the glass conference table with her arms crossed. Chin tilted just high enough to make it clear she thought she'd already won. "Daniel already promised me the promotion," she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "So I don't really see why this needs your approval." Then she looked directly at me, slow and deliberate, like she was studying something decorative but unnecessary. "Who do you think you are here?" The room went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that settles in right before something breaks. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning above us and the faint vibration of someone's phone against polished wood. No one laughed. No one corrected her. She thought I was just the wife. She thought I had wandered into a meeting I didn't understand. She had no idea I owned more of this company than anyone sitting at that table. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I reached into my purse, took out my phone, and dialed my husband. When he answered, I kept my tone steady. "Honey, would you come into the meeting room and explain this for me?" And then I waited. The rest of the leadership team avoided eye contact. Marcus from operations stared at his laptop like it might rescue him. Jenna from accounts folded her hands so tightly her knuckles turned pale. One of the junior analysts looked at me with something that almost resembled sympathy. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't new. Bennett and Rowe Marketing Group had started 5 years earlier in our 2-bedroom apartment. Daniel handled clients, presentations, conferences. He was charismatic, easy with a crowd. I preferred numbers, contracts, long-term strategy. Investors trusted me. Board members called me directly, quietly. I held 55% of the voting shares. But newer hires didn't always know that, on the website, Daniel's photo appeared first. In interviews, he spoke. At industry events, he shook hands while I stood slightly behind him, smiling politely. It had never bothered me. I didn't need applause to understand power. Olivia Grant had joined us 2 years earlier. 28. Sharp. Ambitious. Polished in a way that suggested she had studied confidence in the mirror. She had pushed hard for the director of client strategy role since the previous director left. She had also been scheduling more and more late strategy sessions with Daniel. The conference room door opened. Daniel stepped inside, jacket unbuttoned, expression carefully neutral. His eyes moved across the table before landing on me. Then, briefly, they flicked to Olivia. It was a small glance. Too small. "You called?" he asked. "Yes," I said evenly. "Olivia says you promised her the director promotion." Olivia straightened in her chair. "You told me it was mine." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. "We discussed future opportunities." "That's not what you said," she replied, almost smiling. I kept my gaze on him. "Did you promise her the position?" He exhaled. "I told her she was next in line." That wasn't a denial. A murmur passed around the table. Not loud. Just enough. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Promotions at this level require board approval. Olivia's expression shifted, just a fraction. Surprise. Daniel recovered quickly. We were planning to streamline that process. Streamline. That word echoed in my mind. "Reviewed by whom?" I asked. "We've had conversations," he replied. "Nothing formal yet." Yet, Jenna finally spoke. Hesitant. Is this decided?" Daniel smiled in a way that used to impress clients. "We're aligning leadership with growth." I could feel the narrative forming around me. Visionary husband. Progressive restructuring. Ambitious rising star. And me, the obstacle. Olivia leaned back again, arms crossing once more. "I've already started transition planning," she said. "You said it was a done deal." There it was again. Done deal. I studied my husband's face. If this was a misunderstanding, he could fix it in one sentence. He didn't. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "we can discuss governance adjustments privately." Privately. As if authority were a marital disagreement instead of a legal structure. "No," I said calmly. "We'll clarify now." The room tightened. I stood slowly. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind everyone whose name was on the original incorporation documents. Before any promotion is promised, I said, perhaps we should review who actually has the authority to promise anything in this company. Daniel stared at me, something unreadable settling behind his eyes. For the first time since we built this business together, I wondered whether my husband had mistaken my silence for weakness. No, I repeated, keeping my voice level. We'll clarify now. The air in the room shifted. Like everyone had silently agreed, this was no longer just about a promotion. Daniel straightened, smoothing the front of his jacket. Charlotte, he said, measured and calm. We can revisit leadership structure later. Right now, we're focused on growth. Leadership structure. Not my authority. Not the bylaws. Leadership structure. Marcus and Jenna exchanged a quick glance. It was subtle, but I saw it. The kind of look people give when something they suspected is finally spoken out loud. Olivia leaned forward, confidence returning. I just need clarity, she said. Daniel assured me. Assured. That word landed differently. Not hopeful. Not ambitious. Entitled. I turned to Daniel again. Did you assure her? He hesitated. Just half a second. But half a second is a long time when an entire room is waiting. I told her she was next in line. He said carefully. We've been discussing expanding executive leadership. We need bold decisions. Bold. The implication hung between us. I was cautious. He was bold. I don't recall a board vote, I said. He gave a small, almost patient smile. We were planning to streamline that process. There it was again. Streamline. Streamline how? I asked. A faint tension flickered in his eyes. By reducing unnecessary bottlenecks. We can't scale nationally if every leadership adjustment requires prolonged approval cycles. Unnecessary bottlenecks. I understood then that this conversation had been happening long before today. Olivia sat taller. I've already begun outlining strategy for the tech vertical expansion, she said. Daniel and I reviewed projections last month. Last month. That was when he told me he had a client summit in Austin. Karen from HR cleared her throat. Maybe we should table this and schedule a formal governance review. Olivia rolled her eyes before she could stop herself. I'm not trying to create drama. I was told the position was mine. She looked at Daniel again. Not at me. He turned slightly toward her. No one said it was finalized, he said. But his tone lacked conviction. I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. Then let's be precise, I said. Promotions at director level require board approval under our current bylaws. That hasn't changed. Yet, Daniel added quietly. The word echoed in my head. Yet. So there is a proposal to change it, I said. He didn't deny it this time. We've been exploring governance adjustments, he admitted. You've been focused on investor relations. I didn't want to overwhelm you with internal refinements. Internal refinements. As if reducing my voting control were a minor scheduling tweak. A junior analyst at the end of the table lowered her eyes when I looked in her direction. She knew something. Or at least she'd heard whispers. How long? I asked evenly. Have these refinements been under discussion? Daniel shifted his weight. A few weeks. Olivia spoke before he could continue. It's standard growth strategy. Other firms operate with more agile executive structures. Agile. I could see the narrative forming again. Progressive leadership. Modernization. Efficiency. And me, outdated. Have any amendments been filed with council? I asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. We haven't formalized anything, but you're presenting it as inevitable. I replied. Silence. He glanced around the room as if searching for support. We need alignment, he said finally. Not resistance. Resistance. I almost smiled. So to be clear, I said calmly, you discussed restructuring executive voting authority without informing the managing majority shareholder. The words landed heavily. Olivia blinked. Managing what? I didn't look at her. Voting authority. Daniel exhaled sharply. Charlotte, enough. No, I said softly. Not enough. The room felt smaller now. Claustrophobic. Every employee seated at that table understood that this wasn't about Olivia anymore. Olivia's voice sharpened. I was told I'd be director. I've already started preparing to transition into the role. On whose authorization? I asked. Daniel's. There it was again. Not the board's. Not the bylaws. Daniel's. Charlotte, he said more firmly now. We can address governance adjustments later. Right now, we need to maintain stability. Stability. The word felt almost ironic. If stability was the goal, I replied, you would have included me from the beginning. He didn't answer. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we should adjourn. Daniel nodded quickly. Yes. Let's pause this and reconvene after we align. Align. That word told me everything. As chairs scraped against hardwood and laptops snapped shut. I stayed seated. I watched as employees avoided looking at either of us. Olivia gathered her notes briskly. Her earlier confidence had dulled slightly, but not disappeared. She still believed something had been promised. Daniel stepped closer to me once the room cleared. You're overreacting, he murmured. To what? I asked. Being excluded from decisions in my own company. It's not exclusion, he said tightly. It's evolution. I held his gaze. Then why wasn't I copied on the board calendar entry next week? For the first time? He looked genuinely surprised. You saw that? He asked. Yes, I saw it. And in that moment, I understood something far more dangerous than an office promotion. This wasn't about Olivia. This was about removing me quietly, efficiently, and legally before I even realized the structure was being rewritten around me. I was in my office before sunrise the next morning. The city still gray beyond the glass. The building felt different when it was empty. Honest. No whispers. No careful glances. I opened the shared executive calendar and scrolled to next Tuesday. There it was. Strategic Governance Review, board session. My name wasn't listed as organizer. I wasn't even copied as required attendee. I could see it, but I couldn't edit it. Someone had adjusted my permissions. I leaned back slowly in my chair. That wasn't an accident. That was intention. I pulled the last 3 months of board minutes from the shared drive and began reading line by line. The language had shifted gradually. Leadership realignment. Incentive restructuring. Growth acceleration. My name appeared less often in strategic summaries. Daniel's proposals, on the other hand, were described as forward-looking, adaptive, necessary. I opened one draft version and activated tracked changes. There were comments I had never seen. Suggestions about modernizing voting thresholds. Notes about removing bottlenecks to executive advancement. Bottlenecks. That word again. My phone buzzed once. A text from Daniel. We need to talk before this spirals. I didn't answer. Instead, I called Howard Mills. He'd been our corporate attorney since the 2nd year. When we transitioned from scrappy startup to serious firm, he understood the bylaws better than either of us. I need to see you this morning, I said. He agreed immediately. Howard's office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. He greeted me with a careful expression. I assume this is about Tuesday, he said. You assumed I knew about Tuesday, I replied. He paused. I thought Daniel had discussed it with you. What exactly has he discussed? I asked. Howard folded his hands. He requested consultation about streamlining executive voting requirements. Streamlining how? Reducing board approval thresholds for certain leadership appointments. Potentially issuing performance-based shares to incentivize emerging executives. Performance-based shares. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair. Emerging executives like Olivia Grant, I asked. Howard hesitated. She was mentioned informally. Informally. And equity issuance would affect existing share distribution, I said. Yes, he replied carefully. If structured correctly, it could gradually reduce concentrated control. Concentrated control. My 55%. Without my consent? I asked. Direct dilution of your majority position would require managing trustee approval, he said. However, phased equity grants tied to expansion metrics could alter practical influence over time. So this wasn't a sudden decision. It was positioning. Has anything been filed? I asked. Draft proposals exist, Howard admitted. Nothing executed. Yet. I left his office with a copy of the proposed restructuring outline. Back at headquarters, I pulled internal expense reports from the past quarter. Something had bothered me since the meeting. The Austin weekend. Daniel had told me it was a client summit. The ledger showed otherwise. Luxury resort outside the city. 2 executive suites. 3 nights. Charged to corporate strategic planning. I scrolled further. Meal reimbursements submitted under Olivia's corporate card for the same dates. Same location. My throat felt tight. But my thoughts were clear. I opened archived email threads. There it was. Daniel to Olivia. Once the vote passes, everything changes. Date stamped 3 weeks earlier. The vote passes. Not if... passes. I closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't flirtation. It wasn't carelessness. It was assumption. I thought of the prenuptial agreement we signed before our wedding. Not because we didn't trust each other. Because we respected structure. There had been a clause, one I'd barely considered since that day. Misuse of company assets for undisclosed personal benefit constituted material breach affecting shared asset distribution. At the time, it felt like a safeguard we would never need. Now it felt like a lever. My phone buzzed again. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. I answered immediately. I assume you've seen the calendar entry? She said without preamble. I have, and I'm reviewing documentation. She was silent for a moment. Daniel approached me about governance modernization, she said. I told him I would not support anything lacking transparency. Relief didn't flood me. But something steadied. He believes he has the votes, I said. He believes many things, she replied calmly. But votes are not secured by assumption. After we ended the call, I drafted an email to all board members, requesting full documentation for upcoming governance review, including equity issuance projections and voting structure amendments. I copied Howard. I marked it urgent. Within minutes, Daniel's name appeared at my office door. You're digging through board files, he asked. Why wasn't I told about the meeting? I replied. He stepped inside and shut the door quietly. You're overreacting, he said. Am I? I asked. It's strategy, he insisted. We need to evolve. Without me? I said softly. He didn't answer that. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair. You've been distracted. With what? Investor relations. Stability. Playing it safe. Safe. I looked at him carefully. When a man tells you you're overreacting while preparing to reduce your authority, I said evenly, that isn't evolution. That's displacement. His expression shifted. And for the first time since Olivia crossed her arms in that conference room, I stopped feeling blindsided. I started feeling prepared. He followed me into the kitchen that night like we were about to argue over dishes instead of a company worth millions. I set the printed expense reports on the marble counter between us. He loosened his tie but didn't sit down. Who told you about the board meeting? He asked. Not what did you find? Who told you? That's your concern, I replied calmly. It matters, he said. This kind of internal leak undermines leadership. Leadership. I almost laughed. Were you planning to dilute my voting shares? I asked. He exhaled sharply. It's not dilution. It's strategic growth. By reducing my control, by modernizing structure, he corrected. Without informing the managing trustee, I said. His jaw tightened. You're framing this as betrayal when it's evolution. Then why wasn't I included? You've been focused on investor stability, he said. You resist risk. Or I protect what we built. He stepped closer. You're making this personal. You promised her the position. I motivated her. You assured her. He looked away for half a second. I told her she was next. That's not motivation. That's a promise. He ran a hand through his hair. You're overreacting. There it was again. I'm overreacting to governance restructuring. I asked. Or to being excluded from a board session in my own company. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted tactics. This kind of confrontation damages the brand, he said. Investors don't respond well to visible executive conflict. So I should stay quiet. I'm saying escalation hurts everyone. Everyone, meaning him. I slid the resort receipts across the counter. Explain, Austin. He glanced down, then back up quickly. Leadership retreat. Why wasn't it disclosed as official board travel? It was exploratory. With Olivia, she's senior management. In 2 executive suites. His silence stretched longer this time. You're implying something? He said carefully. I'm asking something. There's nothing inappropriate, he snapped. His phone lit up on the counter between us. Olivia. He flipped it face down immediately. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed steady. That's not helpful optics. He exhaled hard. Don't reduce this to jealousy. Jealousy. I felt something inside me shift from wounded to cold. This isn't jealousy, I said. This is governance and fiduciary duty. He leaned back against the counter. You've always needed control, and you've always resented it. The words landed heavier than I expected. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I built this with you, he said finally. But I've been operating in your shadow. My shadow, I repeated softly. You hold majority shares. You control the board. Every strategic pivot goes through you. That was the agreement. That was 5 years ago, he said. We've outgrown that structure. So you plan to outgrow me? He didn't deny it. He just said, I was trying to rebalance. Rebalance. By issuing equity to an employee who believed she already had the job. You discussed share issuance without my consent, I said. We were exploring options. You were preparing projections. He didn't argue. I looked at him carefully, searching for the man I married instead of the executive standing in front of me. Is there something between you and Olivia? I asked quietly. His eyes hardened. Don't be ridiculous. Then why does she believe she's protected? She's ambitious. She's entitled. He looked away again. His phone buzzed once more against the marble. He didn't flip it over this time. I'm not destroying the company over office politics, he said finally. You already started? I replied. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight. We can fix this quietly, he said. You don't need to escalate to the board. I already have. He stared at me. You'll regret turning this into a war, he said. War. That word settled heavily in the room. I'm not declaring war, I answered calmly. I'm enforcing structure. He laughed once, humorless. You always hide behind paperwork, and you hide behind charisma. The truth of that lingered. The memory surfaced unexpectedly, sitting across from our attorney years ago, signing the prenuptial agreement. Daniel squeezing my hand and saying, we would never need those clauses. Misuse of company assets for personal benefit. Material breach. At the time, it felt theoretical. Now it felt relevant. You're going to use the prenup, he said quietly. Reading my expression, I'm going to use whatever protects what I built. He shook his head slowly. You're willing to risk our marriage for control. I met his eyes steadily. You risked it first. The next morning, his company-wide memo went out before I even reached the office. Subject line: Structural improvements for future growth. He framed it as visionary leadership, strategic modernization, necessary adaptation. Olivia replied publicly within minutes. Excited for the future. I read the memo twice in my office. He was trying to control the narrative. He assumed narrative would intimidate me. Instead, it clarified something I had been slow to admit. This was never just about a promotion. It was about replacing me without confrontation. And I was done being replaced quietly. I arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes early and chose the seat at the far end of the table instead of my usual place beside Daniel. The skyline beyond the glass shimmered in the late morning light. But inside the room, the air felt heavy and deliberate. Daniel stood near the head of the table reviewing printed slides. Confident. Composed. Olivia sat a few seats down. Not technically a board member, but invited as leadership candidate. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore entered next. Without hesitation, she placed her folder beside mine. Not beside Daniel's. He noticed. The meeting began promptly. Daniel moved through his presentation smoothly. Voice steady. Measured. Strategic governance realignment. The slide read, Positioning for national scale. He spoke about growth velocity, competitive agility, modern leadership incentives. He referred to director-level restructuring as anticipated transition. Anticipated. As if the outcome had already been secured. He clicked to the next slide. Equity incentive framework. Projected share issuance charts appeared on the screen. I watched the percentages carefully. If executed over 18 months, my 55% controlling stake would fall below practical majority. Not immediately. Gradually. Quietly. This structure incentivizes high-performing executives, Daniel said. It aligns loyalty with expansion. He gestured toward Olivia. She exemplifies the leadership profile we need. Olivia stood and began her portion of the presentation. She was confident. Rehearsed. She outlined expansion into tech verticals and mid-market clients. She spoke about innovation and dynamic restructuring. Then she smiled lightly. As incoming director of client strategy, I've already begun transition planning. The room shifted slightly. Incoming. No vote had been cast. When she finished, silence settled across the table. Daniel looked satisfied. I let the quiet stretch a few seconds longer than comfortable. Then I spoke. Before we proceed, I said calmly, I'd like to clarify voting authority under current bylaws. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We're reviewing structural adjustments, he said. Yes, I replied. But structural adjustments require managing trustee approval. Several board members glanced at one another. Trustee. I saw confusion flicker across Olivia's face. I am the managing trustee of the majority shares. I continued evenly. Those shares are held under agreement that restricts dilution without my written consent. Daniel shifted in his chair. That's a technicality. It's binding, Mrs. Whitmore said calmly. Her voice carried more weight than anyone else's in that room. Daniel cleared his throat. We're discussing growth incentives, not control removal. Your projections reduce concentrated control, I said. Were these projections reviewed with the managing trustee? Silence. He did not answer directly. We've been exploring options, he said instead. So the answer is no. A murmur passed around the table. I slid printed documents across to each board member. Expense summaries. Austin resort charges. Undisclosed executive travel labeled strategic planning. These expenses were submitted as corporate planning, I said evenly. They were not disclosed in quarterly board summaries. Daniel stiffened. That's unrelated. It's fiduciary documentation, I replied. Olivia spoke sharply. That was legitimate planning. Were reimbursement disclosures filed through standard review channels? I asked her. She hesitated. One board member leaned forward. Were these expenditures disclosed in our financial briefing? Daniel's answer lacked clarity. It was preliminary planning, he said. Preliminary planning that involved equity projections, I replied. Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands neatly on the table. I funded the company's second-year expansion, she said calmly. I did not fund executive secrecy. The words settled heavily. Daniel glanced around the room, searching for alignment. Governance modernization is necessary, he insisted. We cannot operate like a startup forever. No one is resisting growth, I said. We are resisting unilateral restructuring. Olivia's confidence began to fracture. I was told the position was secure, she said quietly. That statement, I replied, was made without board approval. Her eyes flicked to Daniel. For the first time, doubt replaced certainty. Mrs. Whitmore looked directly at him. Transparency is not optional. A motion was introduced to table the dilution vote pending formal fiduciary review. Daniel attempted to interject. This is overreaction. It's due diligence, she corrected. 2 other board members voiced support for review. The vote was called. Postponement passed by majority. Governance restructuring halted. Daniel's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. Olivia sat very still. The narrative he had prepared was dissolving in real time. He tried once more. Let's adjourn and discuss this privately. I met his eyes calmly. Transparency is not adversarial. The meeting closed with a formal resolution to initiate executive conduct review. As the board members gathered their papers and exited one by one, the power dynamic in the room felt unmistakably altered. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Olivia avoided my gaze entirely. He thought I would react emotionally. He never imagined I would respond structurally. The boardroom emptied slowly, but the tension stayed behind like a stain that wouldn't lift. Daniel remained seated long after the last folder snapped shut. Olivia left quickly, heels sharp against the hardwood, eyes fixed straight ahead. Howard approached me quietly. The board has authorized a preliminary fiduciary review, he said. Effective immediately. I nodded once. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a process. Daniel caught up with me in the hallway outside the executive wing. Are you trying to humiliate me? He asked under his breath. You humiliated yourself, I replied calmly. This is unnecessary, he said. You're escalating over nothing. Over nothing, I repeated. You presented dilution projections without trustee consent. It was a proposal. It was positioned as inevitable. His jaw tightened. You're framing this like a coup. I'm framing it like documentation. He leaned closer. You're destroying our company over a misunderstanding. Then the review will clear you. He didn't respond to that. Within 24 hours, Howard requested complete documentation of the Austin retreat. HR pulled expense logs. IT retrieved archived communications tied to company devices. The email thread was clinical at first. Strategy alignment. Expansion timing. Executive synergy. Then the tone shifted. Daniel to Olivia. Once the vote passes, everything changes. 3 weeks ago. Not if the vote passes. When I sat in my office staring at that sentence for a long time. Everything changes. For whom? Howard knocked lightly before entering. We need to discuss the prenuptial agreement, he said. We reviewed the clause together. Misuse of company assets for undisclosed personal benefit constitutes material breach affecting marital asset division. Does executive retreat without disclosure qualify? I asked. If personal benefit is established, he said carefully. Yes. Personal benefit. The phrase felt measured. Legal. Cold. Years earlier, when we signed the agreement, Daniel had laughed and squeezed my hand. We'll never need this. Now I wondered whether he remembered signing it at all. HR called Olivia in for questioning the following afternoon. I wasn't present, but I received the summary. She insisted the retreat was strategic. She admitted Daniel had assured her the equity plan was secured. He said once the board aligned, she told them, the transition would be seamless. Seamless. Like I would step aside gracefully. Another internal email surfaced. Daniel, after restructuring, leadership optics will improve. Optics. The word settled heavily. IT's metadata review revealed late-night messages exchanged through corporate devices. Nothing explicit. But the tone blurred professional boundaries. Familiar. Intimate in subtext. Timestamps matched the Austin weekend. I didn't feel rage. I felt confirmation. The board reconvened through emergency session 48 hours later. Howard presented findings without commentary. Undisclosed executive expenditures. Unilateral restructuring projections. Governance bypass attempts. Mrs. Whitmore spoke next. This company cannot survive executive secrecy, she said calmly. A motion was introduced to suspend Daniel pending completion of full fiduciary review. He looked stunned when the vote passed. Not angry. Disoriented. He waited until the call ended before speaking. "You're trying to destroy me," he said quietly. "I'm protecting what I built," I replied. He shook his head slowly. "You'll regret involving the prenup. That sentence told me everything." He understood the leverage. He understood the risk. By the end of the week, suspension notice was formalized. His executive access was restricted. Interim authority transferred to me. I walked through the executive floor that evening alone. Staff whispered in clusters. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered small nods of quiet support. The narrative was shifting. Daniel texted me later that night. "We can fix this quietly." I stared at the message without replying. Quietly was how he tried to rewrite governance. Quietly was how he tried to remove me. The following morning, I sat in the CEO chair temporarily assigned to me. The leather felt different beneath my hands. Howard called with an update. "Daniel has requested mediation regarding marital separation," he said. Of course he had. This was no longer simply corporate restructuring. It was asset division. Control. Consequences. Daniel requested one private meeting before mediation began. We met in his now empty executive office. "I never intended to remove you completely," he said. "I was trying to rebalance leadership. By reducing my voting power, by modernizing structure, and positioning Olivia as replacement." He didn't answer directly. "I felt overshadowed," he said instead. The truth slipped out quietly. Overshadowed. By the woman who owned majority shares. By the structure we agreed to. I studied him carefully. This wasn't about innovation. It was about ego. The audit process continued. Preliminary findings confirmed undisclosed executive expense misuse and procedural bypass regarding equity issuance. The board finalized their decision the following week. Permanent removal from executive role. Mandatory equity repurchase at pre-dilution valuation. When the vote concluded, there was no dramatic reaction. Just silence. He signed the suspension acknowledgement without looking at me. That evening, my phone buzzed again. "We can still handle this privately," he wrote. I didn't answer. He tried to rewrite the structure of my company. He forgot I knew how to read the fine print. I walked into the executive floor as interim chief executive officer 2 weeks later. And for the first time in months, no one looked confused about who was in charge. The receptionist stood straighter when I passed. Marcus nodded directly instead of glancing past me. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It no longer felt like whispered uncertainty. It felt like waiting. I called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. The conference room was full. People who once avoided eye contact now watched carefully. "I want to be clear," I said, standing at the front without notes. "No executive promotion occurs without documented board approval. No structural changes occur without full transparency." No one interrupted. "We are implementing a formal ethics review process for executive conduct," I continued. "And every leadership position will follow written criteria." There were subtle exhalations across the room. Relief. Caution. Recognition. For the first time since Olivia crossed her arms and questioned who I was. The narrative felt stable. HR concluded their internal review on Olivia 3 days later. She requested a private meeting with me. She entered my office without the sharp confidence she used to carry. Her posture was smaller now. Careful. "I was told the equity was secured," she said immediately. He said it was aligned. Aligned with what? I asked. With the board? With growth? With transition? "You believed I was stepping back." She hesitated. "He said you were focusing on investors. That you didn't want day-to-day leadership." That lie was almost impressive in its simplicity. "He told you that," I said. She nodded. I watched her for a moment. "You violated disclosure protocol," I said evenly. "Your contract will not be renewed at the end of its term." Her expression shifted from defensive to stunned. "You're firing me." "I'm enforcing policy." She swallowed. "I didn't know it would turn into this." Neither did I. But ignorance didn't change structure. Daniel filed a formal objection to his suspension the following week. His attorney argued insufficient evidence of personal misconduct, claimed executive discretion. The board reviewed the documentation again. Undisclosed expenses. Equity projections drafted without trustee consultation. Internal messaging implying inevitability of leadership transition. The vote to maintain suspension was swift. He requested mediation for our separation soon after. We sat across from each other in a neutral office with 2 attorneys between us. His proposal was clean, controlled, quiet. I retain operational control. He retains partial appreciation of company growth value. Howard leaned toward me gently. The fiduciary breach clause strengthens your position, he murmured. Daniel knew it too. He looked tired. I never meant for it to spiral, he said during a break. You meant for it to be seamless, I replied. He didn't argue. Industry whispers started circulating. A trade publication reached out, asking about executive restructuring. I declined sensational commentary. We released a formal statement about governance improvements and leadership stability. Mrs. Whitmore called me personally afterward. You handled that well, she said. Discipline is more impressive than outrage. She also increased her investment allocation under my leadership. That gesture carried more weight than any headline. One afternoon, our senior account director, Lydia, knocked softly on my door. We noticed things before you did, she admitted. The restructuring conversations. The late meetings. How long? I asked. Months. So it had never been spontaneous. It had been preparation. Daniel asked to meet privately once more before final separation terms were signed. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. I felt overshadowed, he admitted finally, staring at his untouched coffee. You controlled the shares. The board listened to you. That was the agreement, I said. I thought restructuring would balance it. By reducing my control without telling me, he exhaled. I thought you'd accept it if it was presented as growth. I studied him carefully. You tried to rewrite authority, I said, without confronting me. He didn't deny it. The final audit report arrived a week later. Confirmed undisclosed executive expenditures. Confirmed procedural bypass attempt regarding equity issuance. The board voted unanimously to remove him permanently from executive role. His shares were repurchased at pre-dilution valuation under shareholder agreement. No growth projections. No strategic multipliers. Just documented value. He packed his office after hours. I stood in the doorway briefly, watching him place framed awards into cardboard boxes. He didn't look at me. There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet sound of consequences settling into place. He thought he was building a future without me. He didn't realize he was building one I would inherit alone. 3 months after the board vote, I unlocked the executive office before anyone else arrived and stood for a moment in the quiet. The skyline outside looked the same. The building smelled the same. But the room felt different. Daniel's framed industry award was gone from the wall. In its place hung the original incorporation certificate from 5 years earlier. The one we signed at our kitchen table when this company was nothing more than a risk and a dream. Charlotte Bennett, Chief Executive Officer. The nameplate on the desk caught the morning light. For the first time. It didn't feel temporary. The reforms rolled out slowly at first. Mandatory board transparency reports. Documented promotion pathways. An internal ethics review process that required executive disclosures in writing. Some people bristled at the structure. Most didn't. At the next all-hands meeting, I reopened applications for Director of Client Strategy. Publicly. Transparently. No quiet assurances. No hallway promises. No private deals. Candidates presented proposals in front of the leadership team. Questions were documented. Votes were recorded. The room felt different during that meeting. Less tense. Less political. Olivia submitted her resignation before her contract ended. Her farewell email was polite and brief. She thanked the team for the opportunity and wished everyone continued success. She did not mention Daniel. She did not mention the promotion. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. Ambition without structure collapses under scrutiny. Daniel's mediation concluded quietly. The prenuptial clause regarding fiduciary breach adjusted the valuation of his equity share. He signed the settlement agreement without theatrics. No raised voice. No last-minute argument. Just signatures and legal language. The marriage ended not with betrayal discovered in a text message, but with documented consequences and calculated silence. We didn't issue a public statement about the separation. The company didn't need another headline. An industry publication revisited our restructuring story a few weeks later. This time, the angle shifted. From executive conflict to governance reform. From scandal to stability. Mrs. Whitmore increased her investment stake shortly after that piece was published. She called me personally. "You protected the structure," she said. "That matters more than charisma." Revenue stabilized. Client retention held steady. Internal morale improved slowly. Cautiously. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, I sat alone in the boardroom. The same room where Olivia crossed her arms and asked me who I thought I was. I could still see her expression, still hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. If I had reacted differently that day, if I had raised my voice, accused him emotionally, stormed out, I might have lost everything. Control isn't volume. It's documentation. It's knowing where the leverage lives. It's understanding that betrayal often hides behind phrases like streamline and modernization. I walked through the executive floor the following week and noticed something subtle. People spoke more openly. Managers referenced policies instead of personalities. Junior staff scheduled meetings with me directly instead of filtering through Daniel. The culture wasn't warmer. It was clearer. The true betrayal hadn't been the promise of a promotion. It had been the assumption that I would remain silent, that I would protect the brand at the cost of my authority, that I would value peace over structure. Silence is not loyalty. Calm is not weakness. I kept thinking back to the moment I took out my phone and called him into that meeting room. "Honey, come explain this for me." At the time, it felt almost reckless. Now it feels inevitable. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone publicly. It's refusing to let them quietly erase you. Daniel and I haven't spoken outside legal necessity since the settlement finalized. He moved into a smaller place across town. He kept a portion of his financial assets. He did not keep control. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post a triumphant announcement. I simply continued running the company I built. On paper, it looks like a corporate restructuring. In reality, it was a boundary. And boundaries don't require shouting. They require enforcement. If you had been in that room when she crossed her arms and asked who you thought you were, would you have stayed quiet? Would you have chosen peace? Or would you have picked up the phone and demanded clarity in front of everyone? I'm curious what you would have done. Tell me in the comments. And if stories about workplace betrayal, power shifts, and quiet revenge speak to you, stay here with me. There's always another meeting, another promise, another moment when someone assumes you won't stand up. Make sure you're here for the next one. Because sometimes the real story doesn't begin with the accusation. It begins the second you decide not to stay silent.